AOC, the politician, has comments on Bitcoin. There is a screenshot that is circulating on the internet where she basically posted on Instagram and took questions. And one of the questions was, do you invest in Bitcoin? AOC's response was the following. Because we have access to sensitive information and upcoming policy, I do not believe members of Congress should hold or trade individual stocks, and I choose not to hold any so I can remain impartial about policymaking. I also extend that to digital assets and currencies, especially because I sit on Financial Services Committee. So the answer is no, because I want to do my job as ethically and impartially as I can. AOC and I don't agree on a lot of things. I tend to think that there are a ton of bombastic statements, a lot of irrational comments. But I will give credit whenever somebody says something that I think is very rational. This, in my opinion, is actually a very, very important point, which is that politicians who have any sort of hand in creating policy, who have any influence over specific industries, etc., it becomes very weird, they use the word weird, that they also would hold assets in those industries. And so ultimately, I don't know how much Congress is actually going to have a hand in influencing policy, et cetera, when it comes to something like cryptocurrencies. That's up for debate. But this specific position around politicians not being able to hold individual stocks or assets that can be impacted by their policy decisions tends to be something that I think is a pretty good idea. Now, I don't think we're ever going to get politicians to agree to create rules for themselves that are more restrictive than, let's say, the average American. Obviously, they usually do the opposite. They say there's rules for thee and not for me. But I do think that this is a pretty good point by AOC. Now, on top of that, what I think becomes really interesting is that whether we are talking about the media or politicians, they should have to disclose that they hold US dollars as well. If you are, let's say, a reporter and you read an article about cryptocurrencies and you hold dollars, there should be a big fat disclaimer at the bottom that says this individual holds majority of their financial portfolio in dollars. Why, if you have to do it for Bitcoin, would you not do it for dollars? Same thing for politicians. Especially if you are being negative towards other assets and you hold something as a store of value, whether you hold treasuries or you hold dollars or cash-like assets, then you should have to disclose that just as much. Do we like AOC's point here, or do we think that this is overblown and maybe not as much as credit as I'm giving her?
I like her point. I think it's actually a very nice thing for her to say, in the sense of she understands that if you're kind of regulating this industry, it's tough to be a part of it. I obviously know the fact that if you have US dollars and you're regulating the US dollar or changing the value of the currency by printing a ton more and stuff like that, it's really tough situation. But yeah, I think it's funny that you've continuously said that if you own real estate and you write about real estate, you should have to disclose that. I don't think you should have to disclose it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think this is kind of what I would say the majority of people believe, right? Is that you should either pay politicians more so they don't have to worry about this kind of stuff, or you should make them put it in a trust where they don't have access to be able to make individual trades. People joke about Nancy Pelosi all the time, but this is the solution to that, right? Is not owning individual stocks, not using your position of power, not using your position of influence to trade and make money on these decisions. And I think that she's right. I think it's unfortunate that some people are put in positions where they are accused of profiting on things off of knowledge, whether they did it on purpose or not. It's a tough position for politicians. And I think that this is the way out of that, right? Is having either someone else manage your money or not owning individual stocks or shares of companies and just doing kind of ETFs or mutual funds or stuff like that. When it comes to digital assets, it's a little more difficult, right? There are sitting politicians right now, sitting senators who own Bitcoin, who have been open about their ownership of Bitcoin. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that AOC is probably open to changing her mind on this. I think it's more about just using education as a tool to get people to do that.
The piece that is important here is, one, disclosures. They're all required to disclose assets. So unless they're either, one, lying on the disclosures, which would be illegal, there'd be a bunch of ramifications if they get caught. But also, two, is I think where people start to get into this weird world is if you remember during 2020, there was the public health crisis that was on the kind of horizon. It was coming, and there was a briefing that was done, and there were stock sales that were all happening. And frankly, people don't know who did what. And so if you have a portfolio that's managed by somebody else, did you make a phone call? Did you not? How did it work? There's always questions. And so I think that generally being able to appeal for the view or the appearance of not being unethical is more important than actually are you unethical or not. Because if people are unethical, for the most part, I think folks either, one, discover it, or two, they get caught, right? So if you're cheating on your taxes, all this stuff, you end up getting caught. Two is that there are politicians, and I see people in the comments saying that, their names. If they're doing weird stuff, people figure it out, right? And again, maybe they don't get actually punished, which is a whole nother issue, but ultimately that stuff kind of tends to rise, right? There are politicians who seem to be some of the best day traders in America. How does that happen? Well, you can start to do your own research on that. So I do think that that stuff is important, but in terms of not owning the individual assets, stocks make a lot of sense. When it starts getting into Bitcoin or other types of assets, do we now have politicians who aren't going to hold other, let's say, foreign currencies, right? Where do you stop the line? Can they not own real estate if they're actually having some oversight over housing? Should they not own their own home? Like, I think there's some parts people like, okay, there's like an irrational extremism to this idea where maybe you should be allowed to own your own home. Right? That seems pretty reasonable. Should you be allowed to invest in real estate? Right? And this goes back to, I think we've talked about on the show before, there was an entire point that somebody made around in New York City, what is the L train, right? Nobody here takes the L, right? Because we don't take L's. But the L train at one point was rumored to get shut down. And so the L train connects Manhattan to Brooklyn at a certain point. And in Brooklyn, a bunch of the real estate, people started to move out of that area because they're like, oh, they're going to shut down the L train. It's going to be very hard for me to get into the city. And so when they did that, real estate prices started to drop, right? Because there's supply demand. So demand was going down, prices started to drop. All of a sudden, it was announced that the L train is not going to be shut down. And instead, what they are going to do is they are going to do the maintenance while it's running during certain hours. So what happened? The real estate prices exploded again in that area right by the L train where it got out in Brooklyn. Now, if you had that information and you went and you started to buy a bunch of real estate a couple of days or a couple of weeks before it was actually publicly announced, is that insider trading? A lot of questions there, right? And somebody like Matt Levine over at Bloomberg, he wrote for like multiple days, he was writing about this idea of like what constitutes actual insider trading. If you have public non-material information of a corporation, definitely insider trading regulators will come after you. Is that public public material information? Kind of. But it's not really a corporation. Now you're talking about policy, but the policy isn't like a regulatory policy. It's literally, are we going to shut down the subway? And you're making investment decisions on a second or third order effect. Gets in a weird world. And so I think that's the type of stuff that people are like, oh, that's a little bit more of a gray area. But there are very specific things that people do where you're like, dude, that's like right there. That was super unethical.